We understand at Kentucky Tennessee Living that many of the views that we expose in history are not always popular or goes against the grain. We have heard over and over again, why dredge up the past? Simply put, we are all looking backwards in time and looking through the lenses of those that have tried to answer the questions before us. While we read these books and articles, we have also taken the view in our storytelling that we take the actual documentation, whether by court records, eyewitness statements, newspaper articles of the day, and other such documentation that occurred between the years of 1880 and 1901 in Appalachian history. The Jones-Wright Hall feud is very complicated. Several murders would escalate the tempers, such as the murders of Saylers, Vance, Higgins, Deputy Sheriff Draughn, and others. This will be a multi-part series telling the events as truthfully as we can, using all of the information that we currently have available. There would be two insults that would cause bad blood between Jones, Hall, and Wright. The first insult was over the refusal of Jones to turn over a young man named Fultz that was under his protection for killing a man in Carter County. The second insult happened when Jones refused to join the Hall and Wright faction. More information about Claib's side of this feud is in his outlaw story, Claib Jones and the Talt Hall feud. These two insults would pit Jones against the Wright and Hall factions of Letcher County. As we have found, many of the feuds so far, they usually start with a conflict over money, land, women, moonshine, or the Civil War. Come along with us as we discover this often forgotten part of Appalachian history. All aboard the Kentucky Tennessee Living Time Machine! Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up the time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Death of Frank Saylers. If there was ever a moment in someone's life when events could be pointed to for a downward spiral for Talt Hall, it would be the death of Frank Saylers. Not only was this event to be the pivot point for Talt Hall, but it would spark a feud that would last many years in Letcher County, Kentucky, between himself and Claib Jones. Hall would never mention this event or even admit that he was the one that caused this to happen. However, according to the Hartfield Herald, published on June 10, 1885, quote, last week Talt Hall, a desperado, and one of his fellows named Johnson, shot and killed Frank Saylers in his own doorway, because he objected to Hall's intimacy with his wife, Saylers' wife. At the coroner's inquest the following day, Hall, the murderer, took exception to the selection of Claiborne Jones as juryman. Jones resented this, and the two got their friends and fought in an open field. Two of the Hall faction were killed and several were wounded. Unquote. However, according to the Hazel Green Herald on June 3, 1885, quote, the origin of the trouble is said to be the killing of a man by the name of Saylers sometime last March in Floyd County, at which time Jones charged that Hall was responsible for the murder. Unquote. Also, according to this same paper, Hall's love for the wife of Saylers was not the only motive for killing him. Quote, on March 6 last, this party, believing that Frank Saylers, a prominent man of this section, had money, made a dash for his home, and would have immediately murdered him but for the timely interference of J.C. Jones, an old and respected citizen of that county, who persuaded them to go away and spare his life. They left at that hour, but returned later in the evening and murdered Saylers and robbed him of what money he had. Unquote. Now, when I first read these articles, I was scratching my head. Why on earth would Talt Hall take an exception to Claiborne Jones being on his jury. And why would it come down to a huge fight out in an open field? Besides, I had never heard of this trouble in Letcher County before this point. So I went onward with the investigation, and this is what I found so far. It was not until I came across the autobiography of Claib Jones that these questions were answered. Claib Jones' testimony. Once again we hear the name of Frank Saylers. This is Jones' eyewitness testimony as to what happened to Saylers that fateful day. Frank Saylers lived on Beaver Creek, 1 mile from Jones. He had a lewd wife who had a loose reputation. Talt Hall stayed at Saylers' home most of his time when he was out on a raid. It didn't take long for Saylers to catch on to what his wife and Hall were doing together. He had enough, and he left for Wise County, Virginia. Saylers stayed there for a while, and on his way back to Kentucky, he stayed several days with John Wright at his home on Elkhorn Creek near Pound Gap, in what is now known as Jenkins, Kentucky. Bill Lee Hall, who was the brother of Talt Hall, was also staying with Wright, and came on to Beaver Creek to tell his brother where Saylers was, and that in a few days he would be home again. In the meantime, Jones had been clearing some land for planting and needed to put up some fencing. He went around looking for hired hands to help him with the project. On his way back home, Jones witnessed Hall and Willie Bates walking with Saylers behind a corn crib. Hall was walking in front of Saylers, and Bates was walking behind him with his hand on the lock of his gun. Jones claims that it was at this point that he stepped up to Hall and begged for Saylers' life. Hall replied that he would not have killed Saylers then, but that he was in this world for a short time. Claib saw that this was a great time to get away from the men and took off for home, because he knew if Saylers was to die right then and there, that he would also be killed for witnessing the act. Later that evening, Saylers was shot and killed as he stepped out onto the steps of his house by some men who were standing in the corner of his house. Bill Bates was the major, Bill Hawk Sizemore was the constable, and Tommy Talton was the judge, and whatever Tommy said was the law. The next day an inquest for the death of Saylers was held. The neighbors and Jones were expected to attend because it was summoned by Sizemore. The inquest ended with a ruling that Saylers had been killed by some unknown person for some unknown reason. However, proof was given at the inquest that about dark that evening, Talt had sent George Johnson and Willie Bates, 2 of his lieutenants, away, even though that there was a big snow on the ground. Hall told Saylers to step out to see if it was not raining. Saylers stepped out onto the porch and said, quote, "Frank, it is sure enough raining," unquote. And then Saylers was shot. Hall ran upstairs and fired the signal gun from the loft to let everyone know that Saylers was dead. The funeral. The next day, Jones goes to Saylers' home to find Hall and Saylers' widow laying across the bed. The couple got up, and the woman was sitting on Hall's lap at the hearth as Jones and Bill Cook dressed Saylers for his funeral. Willie Bates came into the house and drew his gun on Claib, only to have it caught by Sizemore. Jones sat on the bed, and Bates sat next to him with his gun cocked on his shoulder. Jones moved closer to Bates to catch his gun in case he tried to shoot him. Jones states that if the men were not at the front door watching him, that he would have taken Bates' gun and finished him off. But, as it was, Claib helped to take hold of the coffin and carry out the corpse to his grave. On the way to where they were going to bury Saylers, which was not far from Claib's home, he slipped away from the crowd and made a beeline straight for his house. He looked out of a window, and there was Hall on Saylers' horse with the widow right behind him. Claib states that he had lent his bear gun to someone at that time, but he wished that he had it so that he could have ended the whole farce. But, as it was, Jones watched as the jolly party made their way to Bill Bates's fort, while Hall was playing Sour Mountain on his fiddle. At this point, Claib was afraid to stay at his house, so he and his family went to stay with Ben Hall at his home. The next day, one of Talt Hall's spies came to the store and invited Jones and Ben Hall to go with him up the creek. Fearing that this was a planned ambush, Jones and Ben Hall took action. Ben Hall and his wife took his horse and went 5 miles to the home of Miles Hall. Claib Jones took a different path through the woods and met Ben Hall there. Jones' wife would go back home and stay there until Jones sent word to her for her next move. Forged letter and trouble. When Claib Jones' wife had reached the home, she found that the roof had been torn off of the smokehouse and all of the meat was stolen. Also, the mill barrel had been turned over, as well as a huge mess had been left around the house. The same day that Saylers was buried, George Johnson and Willie Bates gave false testimony that they found a letter written by Ben Hall's wife that Claib had been hired by Ben Hall to kill Saylers. With everything mounting against them, Hall and Jones felt that they needed to leave the area immediately. Just as Ben Hall was fixing to leave for safety, Big John Hall alerted everyone that Talt Hall, John Wright, and several others were 1/2 a mile away hiding in the forks of the creek. Unarmed Jones took to the woods and fled to Sherwood Osborne's and got a .45 gun off of him for protection. Claib goes for help. Ben Hall's father, Captain Boland Hall, was at Mount Sterling at the time taking care of his stock. He came back to the country and gathered Ben, his wife, and Jones's wife to take back with him. Claib had went through the mountains and made it to Hindman, the county seat of Knott County. While there, Jones took out warrants for the parties who had murdered Saylers. However, the sheriff nor any of the county officials were willing to take up the warrants against Hall and his band of outlaws. Jones then went to Dick Vance for help in the matter. Attempted murder of Dick Vance. According to Jones, there had been an attempt on Dick Vance's life by the Talt Hall gang. This was because Vance was also a moonshiner that was facing federal charges for moonshining in Catlettsburg, which is located in Boyd County, Kentucky. Vance had been staying in a room with John Adams from Letcher County, Kentucky. Due to Vance not being able to sleep that night, he saw one of Hall's spies enter his room, strike a match, and look at his face. Vance let the spy leave the room and went to a separate part of the hotel to go to bed. This saved John Vance's life, as not long after that, John Adams' sleeping body was hurled out of a third-floor story window by Talt Hall, Uriah Bates, and Andy Hall. Adams had been shackled by both hands and feet as he was on the way to Louisville, Kentucky to face federal charges. There are sources that state that Adams had jumped out of the window on his own accord to escape the charges. These sources claim that Talt Hall was on guard duty at that time. Several other sources state that Adams was murdered as it was a case of mistaken identity. Death of Andy Hall and Linville Higgins. One of the suggested starting points of the feud comes from the deaths of Andy Hall and Linville Higgins. We do have a record of Linville's death taking place on August 15, 1884. Upon the return of Vance to Knott County from federal court, Vance waylaid and shot Andy Hall from a hidden spot in the brush. The Linville Higgins Find a Grave source states that Vance shot Hall while he was climbing a fence with a sack of potatoes on his back. It is thought that Linville Higgins and Andy Sloan also participated in the shooting of Andy Hall. It was not long after the death of Andy Hall that Linville Higgins was murdered. According to the Appalachian Quarterly, September 1998, quote, Old Dave Hall, father of Talton Hall, had been considered as a suspect in the murder of Linville Higgins. However, Dave Hall, who was also father of Andrew Hall, had no part in the killing other than possibly relishing the death of one of the gang that had murdered his son. 3 men were indicted for the Higgins murder, one of which was positively identified as Wash Craft of Letcher County. 2 other suspects were Sam Wright and Benjamin Jones, unquote. According to the Linville Higgins Find a Grave source, quote, 3 men were identified for the Higgins murder, one of which was positively identified as Wash Craft of Letcher County. Two other suspects were Sam Wright and Benjamin Jones. Sam, known as, quote, kinky-haired Sam, unquote, was the son of Joel E. and Eliza Wright and brother of Devil John Wright. It is also mentioned that William S. Wright was implicated in this murder. W.S. was the son of Sidney Wright and cousin of Devil John, unquote. We will swing back around to this event next week as John Wright would face off against Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn and enter the feud. Missed opportunities. According to the autobiography of Claib Jones, the first missed opportunity to capture Hall came when Vance, Jones, and their men were within 40 yards of Hall sitting in his yard reading a newspaper. It began to snow, and so Hall walked into Fort Bates, and the men had to give up the hunt. Hall got wind that the men were after him and went to Fort Wright for safety, and only returned when the men put out a rumor that they had left for Ohio. The second missed opportunity came when Hall, dressed in Saylers clothing and driving his oxen, passed by the party unrecognized. His identity was later confirmed by Jones and German Isaacs. The group was able to gather 5 more men from the Isaacs family and returned for another try to arrest Hall. Fort Bates shootout according to Claib Jones. After all the men and guns were gathered, it was time to go to Fort Bates. Everyone was in the house, but there was something odd about the appearance of the area. Nell Bates, Talt Hall's sister, walked out of the house, walked to the road, looked up and down the road, walked around the house, and then up the hill. Soon afterward, Bill Bates and Black Hawk Sizemore came out of the fort and went up to the barn. Then, all of a sudden, Hall and his men came out of the back door in a run. As soon as they got into range, Jones ordered their surrender. The men made ready for battle, but Jones shot Talt Hall first in the shoulder and knocked him down. He got back on his feet and staggered toward the fort. His sister Nell grabbed him and pulled him into the fort by the back door. Shots rang out of the fort for quite a while. In the middle of the battle, Talt Hall's wife came out of the fort onto the porch, climbed onto a fence, and exclaimed, quote, "Hurrah for old Claib Jones! Kill all of them, and that damn Saylers woman too," unquote. Jones called back to her saying that it was what he was intending to do. The fight continued, but the ammo that the Vance Jones side was using would not penetrate the logs of the fort. Mac Hall was with Jones and his side, and he was wounded and died a few days later. Hall and his men slipped out and left the fort that night. The next day, on Jack's Creek in Floyd County, Hall and his men waylaid and killed Abner Little, who was the constable who was with Jones at the attack of Fort Bates. Hall and his men fled for Fort Wright on Elkhorn. Jones and 3 of his men went to Cincinnati to buy 37 Winchesters and returned to Knott County. Upon their return, the jailer of Knott County, Isom Sloan, and Deputy Letcher County Dolph Draughn swore out warrants on Claib Jones, Dick Vance, and the rest of their party for wounding Talt Hall and others in the shootout. The men gave their bond to get out of jail. The governor of the state of Kentucky offered a reward of $500 for the capture and arrest of Talt Hall and each of his men. Jones was appointed as special bailiff to arrest them. John Wright enters the feud. We have heard different versions on how close John Wright and Talt Hall were in their friendship. It is really unclear if Hall was working for Wright as one of his lieutenants or if he was a captain over his own faction. According to Claib Jones, Hall was working for Wright and was protected in all that he did. According to the Hazel Green Herald from the Wolfe County, Kentucky, in their October 28, 1885 edition, there was a 3-way feud going on in Letcher County. The players were the Wright family, captained by John Wright, the Jones family, headed by Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn, and Hall family, which was Talt Hall, as the captain. At no time did Claib Jones mention that he was working in tandem with Dolph Draughn. We will see these two men come to loggerheads at a later time, after the capture of Fort Wright, and the feud would become a four-faction quarrel. What is clear is that Wright was willing to take up for Hall's side of the feud and ready to protect him at all costs. He makes this very clear when he sends a letter to Claib Jones. Jones speaks about this in his autobiography. We do know that during the trial of Talt Hall that there was a fear that John Wright and his faction would break him out of the Wise County jail. The fear was so great that Wise County Sheriff Wilson Holbrook added more guards to the jail. The news of the shootout at Fort Bates did not sit very well with John Wright. Since Talt Hall was a friend and under his protection in Letcher County, he would do all he could to protect him. So, he sent a message to Claib Jones stating that the good citizens of Letcher County would shoot and kill Jones and his men on sight. To test out to see if this was true, Jones went to Letcher County. He found that this was not true, as all of the people there were friends to law and order and were friendly to Jones and his men. There did not seem to be any hostility in the area whatsoever toward anyone who was coming to arrest Hall and his men. John Wright versus Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn. If we go under the assumption that Jones and Draughn were working together to capture the Hall faction, the following excerpt from the Hazel Green Herald dated October 28, 1885, would make sense. Since Draughn would have been part of the shootout at Fort Bates, and Talt Hall was wounded, and several men were killed in the attempt to arrest Hall and his men. According to the same article, John Wright hated Deputy Sheriff Draughn, and at one point asked the governor of the state of Kentucky to come and cage him. Both Wright and Draughn were of considerable wealth and influence in the county, while the newspaper also says that Hall had a lot of property as well. According to the article, Hall and Wright were not acting in unison with each other. They were both working against Draughn and his faction and resisting arrest concerning the murder of Frank Saylers. The capture of Fort Wright. Claib Jones had struck out on his own with 20 or so of his men and went to Fort Wright. After watching for a short time, several men came out of the fort carrying their guns, at which a gunfight ensued. Wright and his men fought a running fight all the way to the Cumberland Mountains. Wright had a breech-loading gun and peppered the buckshots all around Jones and his men. The only man wounded at Fort Wright was Bill Bates, who was shot in the back with a Winchester bullet that had went through a fence post first and then embedded itself just under his skin. After Wright had made his escape, his wife fixed Jones and his men breakfast when they returned to the fort. After a search of the fort, Jones went to the second-floor story of the building, where they found and arrested Miles Bates, Black Hawk Sizemore, and Bill D. Hall, who was the brother of Talt Hall. Jones then took the prisoners towards Prestonsburg, Kentucky. Draughn's failed attempt to arrest John Wright. The newspaper article goes on to say that all of the men in this trouble were related to each other and they hated each other. It also states that Deputy Sheriff Draughn gathered together a posse of about 30 men to arrest Wright. They were ambushed on the way to carry out their duties, and a general fight ensued, in which several men were wounded. We can assume that the reason why Dolph Draughn wanted to arrest Wright was for the action of aiding and abetting Hall and his faction, which was illegal. The ambush in question could have been when Dolph Draughn attempted to capture Fort Wright during one of his many raids that took place. According to Claib Jones, Deputy Dolph Draughn had made a posse of men of his own and had made a raid on Fort Wright. This was not successful, and upon their return trip, Draughn and his men were waylaid and ambushed by Wright and his men, and a gunfight ensued. One of Draughn's men had been killed, and the horse that Draughn had been riding had been shot out from underneath him. Claib Jones versus Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn. According to Jones, on the way to Prestonsburg, they stopped for the night in Hyman, Kentucky. There they had met up with Deputy Dolph Draughn, who relayed the story of his failed attempt to arrest Wright. Draughn wanted revenge for this and was determined to kill Bates, Sizemore, and Hall. Jones told him that if he wanted to kill men, then he needed to capture his own. Draughn gave the orders for his men to line up to shoot the prisoners. Jones and his men got in front of the prisoners and drew their guns. Draughn saw that it was going to be a fight and withdrew his men and left. Thus, on this trip, Fort Wright was broken up, and John Wright and his men fled to Virginia. Jones made it to Prestonsburg the next day, and the prisoners were placed in the Floyd County Jail. The jailer, Jim Lane, was afraid that Wright would come and do a jailbreak, releasing the prisoners. Jones went to court and got permission to have an extra man guard the prisoners. Cicero Cox was chosen by Jones as a guard. There was a large reward offered for Talt Hall, George Johnson, and others, but there was no reward for John Wright. The fate of the Hall faction. According to the Daily Evening Bulletin dated December 21st, 1885, William J. Bates, Miles Bates, and George Johnson, 3 alleged murderers from Floyd County, were captured and brought to jail. They were charged with the killing of Mac Hall and Ab Little in Floyd County sometime last June. A reward of $150 was offered for their capture. A scheme was fixed up between the 2 Bates and Johnson and some of their friends to secure this reward. The accused were to surrender themselves to the authorities, and then as soon as the reward had been paid, they were all to be released again. Some of Ab Little's friends, however, dropped into the scheme and determined to take the prisoners out and hang them. In order to prevent this, they were brought to Catlettsburg last Friday and lodged in the jail at that place. After some time, John Wright brought in all of the other men from the Hall gang except for Talt Hall, Wash Craft, and George Johnson. John Wright got the reward for all of the men he turned in. Wash Craft had left the area. They must have been released at a later date, because in 1891, Miles Bates would make his way to Norton, Virginia, and be the cause behind the murder of Ennis Hilton. George Johnson would be found dead in the woods, shot by what he thought to be one of his friends. The fate of Bill D. Hall and William J. Bates is kind of uncertain. According to the William Billy D. Hall Find a Grave website, he died in Knott County, Kentucky on March 1st, 1909, at the age of 86. According to the Genii website, William J. Bates died on March 8, 1919, at the age of 79 in Knott County, Kentucky. End of the feud. According to the New York Times, for the right side of the feud, it was quelled on September 19, 1885, when the fight escalated and Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn, Sam Cook, and William Francis were killed. However, for Talt Hall, the fight was not over and would continue between his side and Jones for many years. As for Wright and Hall, they would become best of friends after this point in their history. Talt Hall would face the gallows in Wise County, Virginia on September 2, 1892, for the murder of police officer Ennis Hilton. John Wesley Wright would die at the age of 86 in Pound, Virginia on January 30, 1931. Claib Jones would die in Warren, Kentucky on November 25, 1914, at the age of 88 years old. Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian feuds. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click that bell for notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.